At this point in the Gospel of Matthew, we are in the final week in the life of Jesus, and we're only days away from the cross. Last time we saw the religious leaders had come to Jesus and began asking him questions about his authority to do the things that he was doing. Who do you think you are to overturn the tables and to drive out the money changers and the merchants? Who do you think you are to teach the things that you're teaching in the temple? Who do you think you are? He was heralded as the Messiah. He was healing. He was doing all these things. And we realized that as we're moving closer and closer to the cross, there's really nothing Jesus can do or say that's going to change the minds of these religious leaders. And so Jesus gave them 3 successive parables that exposed their dishonesty and also their rejection of him as the Messiah. And they also served as a warning that if they stayed the course, they were in danger of judgment. However, rather than repent, they now go on the offensive. And we're going to see several different religious groups fight back by launching a counterattack, asking Jesus a series of contentious questions to try to completely discredit him in front of the people, both politically and spiritually. The first question is asked by the Pharisees and the Herodians. The second question comes from the Sadducees, and then the third question is asked by a lawyer. In every religious system, there quickly become divisions. In every religious system, there's always this conservative branch that, they're sometimes called the fundamentalists. They're holding on to the fundamentals of the original thing, the conservative branch. And then there's always a liberal branch and then other branches in between. Within many Protestant denominations, there are branches. There's the conservatives, there's the liberal, and all manner of that in between. And in Judaism, there were also divisions. But these divisions all come together when they found a common opponent. And that's what they found here. That's what we're going to see in the remaining verses of chapter 22. Looking at the king's defense as Jesus responds to 3 loaded questions that come at him from all different angles. But then Jesus will ask a question of his own. We will see that. So first we notice this question from the Pharisees, a question about responsibilities. It's from the Pharisees and the Herodians. Look at verse 15. Then the Pharisees went and plotted how they might entangle him in his talk, and they sent to him their disciples with the Herodians. Now, under normal circumstances, the Pharisees and Herodians did not collaborate with one another at all. In fact, they were in bitter opposition. Of course, the Pharisees, they were the most orthodox sect of the religious leaders. They were very legalistic. They were the, quote, conservatives. They were legalistic, and because of that, they did not believe it was right to pay taxes to Rome. They saw taxation as an infringement on their relationship with God. I mean, hey, to give money to a Gentile king, there's no king but God, Jehovah God. So, among other things, the Pharisees were against taxation. The Pharisees hated Rome, and they also hated the Herodians, because the Herodians were Jewish people who were behind the Herod dynasty. They supported the Herod dynasty. Thus, they were called Herodians. They were politically inclined. They loved the rule, or at least they were behind the rule of the Herods. And yet, both of these groups that opposed each other, they get together because they both hate Jesus more than they hated their political differences. So they sent to him, verse 16, they sent to him their disciples with the Herodians, saying, "Teacher, we know that you are true and teach the way of God in truth, nor do you care about anyone, for you do not regard the person of men." Now, when you look at this opening statement, everything that they said about Jesus was absolutely correct. Jesus is true. He's the way, the truth, and the life. Jesus did teach the way of God in truth. And he expounded the scriptures like no one ever had before. And this last statement spoke of his integrity. That's what it's referring to. Jesus was a man of integrity. He didn't allow the opinions of other people to sway what he was teaching. So their words were true, their accusation here, but they didn't mean any of it. They're just pouring out the flattery, which flattery is just an evil form of deception. And it's at its most evil when it includes truth in it, which is exactly what they're doing. Judas would use flattery to betray Jesus in just a few days from here. He said, "Oh, I love you, Jesus." And how did he betray Jesus? With a kiss. He betrayed him in that sense. So that's what they're doing here. They're using flattery to butter him up, as if Jesus would be so insecure or foolish enough to be impressed by their flattery, their hollow praise, as if Jesus could be flattered. Well, that's what they do. And then now they come with the question, verse 17, "Tell us, therefore, what do you think? Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not?" And I know we're all hoping he says no, right? That's what we hope he says. Now, this is a question about their responsibility and just our responsibility of paying taxes. Now, the Romans had three kinds of taxes. There was what was called the ground tax, which was 10%. It's a 10% tax on all of the grain or produce, and 20% is a 20% tax on oil and wine. And being primarily an agrarian society, that was a lot of the people that were paying this 10 and 20% tax on this ground tax. There was also an income tax, which was 1% of your income. I know we're thinking, 1%? I would take that any day, a 1% tax. But there was more. They had a lot more taxes going on. There was what was called the poll tax, paid by everyone up to age 65. This tax was 1 denarius a year, and a denarius was 1 day's wage for a soldier. And this poll tax was the most obvious sign of submission to Rome. Zealots claimed that this poll tax was God-dishonoring. It was a dishonoring badge of slavery to the pagans. But what they're trying to do by asking this question, is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not? That word lawful does not refer to Roman law. Of course, it was Roman law that you pay your taxes. They're referring to the law of God. Is it permissible for the people of God to express allegiance to a pagan emperor? They're trying to create a dilemma for Jesus, because if he says, yes, pay your taxes to Caesar, then he could be accused of denying the sovereignty of God over Israel, making him very unpopular with the people, the Jewish people, because most of them were not too fond of paying taxes to the Roman government. Sure, they had peace, that enforced peace called the Pax Romana, but they're having to pay to be oppressed. They must pay to be conquered by Rome. And yes, they got the Roman roads, the Roman aqueducts, and all the enforced peace, but they were paying the very people who were oppressing them. Not only that, but the little coin, the denarius that they were required to give, especially for the poll tax, that day's wage, the denarius, it was a silver coin, and it was only Caesar could call for the minting of gold or silver and the minting of coins. And the denarius, it had one side was a profile picture of Caesar, his image, his inscription was on it. And on the other side was a picture of Caesar seated, wearing these flowing robes of justice. So the Jews, who hated any imagery at all, saw the paying of this tax as a sort of double whammy. Hey, we hate paying to be oppressed, and we hate the fact that we're having to pay with a denarius that has this idolatrous image on it. So the Jews do not cast images. So if Jesus says, yes, pay your taxes, he would lose favor with all the people. But if he says, no, don't pay your taxes, then he would be making himself an enemy of Rome. And the Pharisees and Herodians together would have then gone to Caesar or to the local authorities and said, hey, this guy is an insurrectionist. So these two groups get together to try to trap Jesus with this question, and they think they have him. But verse 18, Jesus perceived their wickedness. Jesus sees right through their false pretense. And he said, why do you test me, you hypocrites? Now, that's a word that gets thrown around a lot these days, a hypocrite. But these men were truly Hypocrites. They're wearing a mask. It's a term for an actor. And back in those days, they would wear, you've seen the little mask, the happy face, the sad face. That's how they would act on a stage in those days. But that's where the term comes from. And they were presenting themselves as one thing, but they were really someone else. That's what's happening. And Jesus says, you're putting on an act. You're role-playing. You're trying to test me. And that's true of all false teachers. They're just playing a role in order to deceive people. They are insincere. They are hypocrites, as Jesus uses the term here. So before Jesus answers the question, he calls them out. You hypocrites. I'm going to answer your question, but I want you to know that I know what's going on here. I know what's in your heart here. Verse 19, show me the tax money. So they brought him a denarius, and he said to them, whose image and inscription is this? They said to him, Caesar's. And he said to them, render therefore to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. He says, hey, it has his face on it, give it to him. Jesus is affirming that the government makes legitimate requests of us. We are responsible to God in all things, but we are to be obedient to government in civil and national matters. Peter put it this way in 1 Peter 2, verse 17, fear God, honor the king. And Paul made it clear in Romans chapter 13 that believers are to pay their taxes and submit to their government in terms of how they live their lives before the Lord. Every Christian, we all have dual citizenship. We are citizens of the nation in which we happen to live, but we are also citizens of God's kingdom. And with that, just as it is right for Caesar to collect taxes and for our government to collect taxes, it's also right for God to collect worship and devotion. That's what he says next. And to God, give to God the things that are God's. Because everyone has the image of God impressed on them. This means we belong to God, not to Caesar, not to our earthly government. We don't even belong to ourselves. We belong to the Lord. One commentator put it this way: the image of princes stamped on their coin denotes that temporal things belong all to their government. The image of God stamped on the soul denotes that all its faculties and powers belong to the Most High and should be employed in His service. God wants you. God wants us. He wants all of you. And God is after your heart. He's getting to the heart. Render to God the things that belong to God. Give Him yourself. In verse 22, when they had heard these words, they marveled and left him and went their way. So he answers that. One statement silences them and they go away. But now another group called the Sadducees come with their trick question. And the Sadducees, they were polar opposites of the Pharisees. The Pharisees, they were the radical ritualists and the legalists. Well, the Sadducees were the rationalists. They didn't believe in the resurrection. They didn't believe in angels. They didn't believe in spirits. They were anti-supernatural. They didn't believe in the Old Testament except for the first 5 books of Moses. The Sadducees, they were like the ancient version of the modern liberal theologians. They were very liberal in everything. They were wealthy, aristocratic, and they were the governing class who happened to have had control of the temple for hundreds of years. So they were the rich, wealthy liberals side of things in this day and age. So they come now with a question about resurrection, beginning in verse 23. The same day, the Sadducees, who say there is no resurrection, came to him and asked him, saying, Teacher, Moses said that if a man dies, having no children, his brother shall marry his wife and raise up offspring for his brother. Now there were with us 7 brothers. The first died after he had married, and having no offspring, left his wife to his brother. Likewise the second also, and the third, even to the 7th. Did you get that? So there's 7 boys in the family. The eldest marries. He doesn't have any children. Then all of these other brothers successively follow, and they marry her. no one has kids, and you go, well, why would they do that? I'll get to that, but don't forget, the Sadducees, they do not believe in the resurrection. So they're trying to come up with this ridiculous hypothetical story to show that the idea of resurrection is nonsense. And this is the story they lay out, and they're appealing to a law in the portion of the Bible that they do believe from the first 5 books of Moses, or also called the Torah or the Pentateuch. And they're citing a passage from Deuteronomy chapter 25, which is called the law of the levirate marriage, Levirate. It's found in Deuteronomy 25. It says that if a married man dies childless, it was his brother's responsibility to marry and to impregnate his brother's widow, and then count that child as the deceased husband's descendant. And you're asking, well, why would they do that? Why was that ever enacted? It was to preserve the deceased man's name in Israel and to keep the tribal allotments of the land under his name in perpetuity. So that's what it was all about, the preservation of the name and the tribes and the land, the allotment of the land. So this hypothetical story is based upon a law in the Bible, a law that was practiced. In fact, you see it played out in the book of Ruth, with Ruth and Boaz. In the book of Ruth, there was the guy Elimelech and his wife Naomi, and they took their 2 daughters. They fell into poverty, so they go across over the Dead Sea to the other side to Moab, the land of Moab, where their 2 sons find wives there, Orpah and Ruth. But then Elimelech dies, the 2 husbands die, so it's just Naomi and her 2 daughters-in-law. And they come back to Israel, the land of Israel, and Naomi with her 2 daughters-in-law, Ruth and Orpah. And because Ruth's husband had died, he owned land, but because he's dead, the only way to redeem that land and to get it back was through a relative, a kinsman, for him to marry Ruth and be able to buy the land. There was a relative who was closer to Ruth than Boaz, but he said, I don't want the job. I'm married. I have a family. I'm going to pass. So you could do that. You could pass on that. So Boaz was now able to do this and to pay for the land and to marry Ruth. And you see this, you should go read the book of Ruth. It beautifully describes this. That's the law of the levirate marriage. So these Sadducees, they're using this law to come up with this story to try to prove their point about the idea of a resurrection, that it's ridiculous. And here's how they do it. Verse 27, last of all, the woman died also. Therefore, in the resurrection, whose wife of the 7 will she be? For they all had her. They were all married to her. So in the resurrection, whose wife is she going to be? I love Jesus' response, verse 29. Jesus answered and said to them, you are mistaken. Now, if anybody out there, if you're reading the old King James, I love the way the old King James says it here. Sometimes you just can't get past the original. He says, you are ignorant. That's what it says in the old King James. You are ignorant. You are mistaken, not knowing the Scriptures nor the power of God. Jesus notes 2 reasons why they are mistaken. They didn't know the Scriptures, even though they thought they did. And second, they didn't know the power of God, which makes sense because they were anti-supernaturalists. They didn't believe in any of that stuff. Because if they knew the power of God, they would know that God is able to raise the dead. And if they knew the Scriptures, they would know God will raise the dead. Those were 2 things they were mistaken about. And Jesus proceeds to remind them that life in the resurrection is quite different than this life. It doesn't merely continue on like this particular world operates. There are differences. It is a life completely different, in a completely different order. Verse 30, for in the resurrection, they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are like angels of God in heaven. Now, there's a lot in that verse. I realize that this passage has caused some concern for many people. Concern over, well, am I going to even know my wife when we're in heaven? Or are we going to be around each other? Are we still married? All these kinds of questions come up. Here's the thing. We're not told enough about life in the world beyond to answer in great detail, but we can understand a few principles. First, family relationships will still be known in the world beyond. We know that because of the rich man that Jesus described in the afterlife who was aware of his family relationships in Luke chapter 16. So we'll know who our family members are. We're not going to be ignorant of that. We're going to know who our family members are in our family relationships. Another thing is the glory of heaven will be a relationship and a connection with God that surpasses anything else, including our present family relationships. And if it seems that life in the resurrection does not include maybe some of the pleasures of life that we know here on earth, it's only because the joys and satisfactions of heaven are far superior. It's going to be way better. Because we can know that with certainty. No one's going to be disappointed in heaven. So whatever disappointments you might think are there, no, it's going to be even better. But Jesus, he doesn't say that when people die, they become angels after the resurrection. There are a surprising number of people who believe that we turn into angels somehow, and then we get our wings, right, with the bell. No, that's from a movie. That's not biblical. It doesn't say they turn into angels. He says they will be like angels, meaning they're going to be immortal. We will be immortal. Remember, the Sadducees don't believe in angels. And Jesus says, well, here's the truth, guys. When people die, they are like the angels. So he affirms there are angels. They are eternal. They no longer have the need to propagate like you do on earth. So thus, there was not the need for marriage. In heaven, in eternity, there will be no need. We are eternal beings. That's one of the points he's making. Second, he's dealing with people who don't believe in angels or a resurrection. So he educates them on both in his response to prove that there is, in fact, a resurrection. And he's going to do it in just a couple of sentences. Now, like I said, they believe in the first 5 books of Moses. So he's going to quote from one of the books that they do believe in, beginning of verse 31. Now, but concerning the resurrection of the dead, have you not read what was spoken to you by God, saying, I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob? God is not the God of the dead, but of the living. He's quoting Exodus chapter 3, verse 6, where God is speaking to Moses in that passage. And at that moment, when God speaks to Moses, Abraham is dead, Isaac is dead, and Jacob is dead. And Jesus says, have you not read the text carefully where God the Father speaks in the present tense, not the past tense? He doesn't say, I was the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He says, I am present tense, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Because when you speak in the present tense and say, I am the God of Abraham, that indicates that the people are still alive. There is a present tense relationship with them. And once a person's dead, I know we no longer speak of them in present tense. We speak of them in past tense. But God was speaking in the present tense to show that the scriptures themselves say that there is life, that they are living. There is a resurrection. God says, I, in the present tense, have a relationship with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob, the patriarchs, even though they have died long ago. Isn't that brilliant? Isn't that just masterful, the way Jesus responds in this situation? So watch what happens, verse 33. And when the multitudes heard this, they were astonished at his teaching. The Sadducees said nothing because they could say nothing. They have no comeback at all. And the people went, wow, Jesus put these Sadducees in their place with just a few sentences. Verse 34. But when the Pharisees heard that he had silenced the Sadducees, they gathered together. So, okay, let's huddle up, boys. We got to get together on this. We're all in this together here, and otherwise we're in trouble. So now they bring in the lawyer. The lawyer who comes with a question about the royal law, verse 35. Then one of them, a lawyer, asked him a question, testing him and saying, "Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law?" In asking Jesus to choose one great commandment, they're hoping that they can make Jesus show neglect for the other commandments, the other areas of the law. Now, this man, he was a religious lawyer, and he knew the law of Moses. But the law of Moses, it's not only religious, it's also a social law. When you live in a theocracy, every religious law is a social law as well. They're all intertwined. And that's what was used to govern the country, the nation of Israel. As a lawyer at that time, the Jews believed not just in one commandment or two commandments or even 10 commandments. They had gotten it up to 613 commandments. There were 248 positive, 365 negative commandments. That's a lot of commandments to then come and ask, which one is the greatest? Now, as time went on, the Jews corresponded the 248 positive commandments with what they had come up with, the 248 portions of the human body. So they ascribed all of these positive laws to different parts of the body. And since the calendar changed from 360 calendar days per year in the Babylonian calendar to now 365 days in the Julian calendar, the Jews will say the reason God gave 613 commandments, 248 positive, 365 negative, so that you will worship him with all of your being every day of the year. And it's a bit of a stretch, but it's a beautiful thought nonetheless. But that's what they came up with. But that was in this lawyer's mind when he asked Jesus, "Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law?" Now, watch what Jesus says. Verse 37, Jesus said to him, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the first and great commandment." This is the basic affirmation of faith in Judaism. It's called the Shema. It's found in Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 4 and 5. "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength." So instead of picking one commandment and placing it over another, Jesus defines the law in its core principle. Love the Lord with everything you have, and love your neighbor as yourself. So he adds on, verse 39, "The second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets." So I love that. He's asked, what's the greatest one? He gives two. But the second stems out of the first. He has taken all of the positive and all of the negative, all the 10 commandments, and said you can sum them up in two things. Love God with everything within you, and love your neighbor as yourself. In fact, if you look at the 10 commandments, the 10 commandments were given on 2 tablets. And the first 4 commandments were on the first tablet. All of those first 4 commandments have to do with your relationship with God. They're all vertical in nature. You're dealing with God in the first 4 commandments. The second tablet had this next 6 commandments. They deal with your relationships with other people. They're horizontal. It's person to person. Now, there has been some confusion about what it means to love your neighbor as yourself. Does that mean we must love ourselves before we can love anyone else? What this means is, in the same way we already love ourselves, in the same way we take care of ourselves and that we're concerned about our own interest, we are to take care and have concern for other people. So summing up the 10 commandments, Jesus says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. Because if you do that, you won't break any of the 10 commandments. If we're actively doing that, if you love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind, you're not going to take his name in vain. If you love the Lord your God, you're going to honor the Lord with at least one day a week, if not your whole life. Every day you're resting in the Lord. You're entering into that Sabbath rest. And if you love your neighbor as yourself, you won't covet. You won't steal, and you won't be killing people. You won't kill your neighbor because you love. So Jesus concisely sums up the entire Old Covenant law with love being at the heart of it. Because love is the basis for obedience. Love becomes the motive for everything. Love is the basis of obedience. So verse 40, on these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets. And if you go back to the Sermon on the Mount, which we covered in Matthew chapter 5, remember Jesus took the law a bit further, didn't he? He said the law doesn't just govern what you do, it governs what you think. It's not just your action, it's your attitude. It's your thoughts. It's what's in your heart. He said, have you heard that it was said to those of old, you shall not murder? And then he goes on to say, I say to you that whoever is angry with his brother without a cause shall be in danger of the judgment. He takes the law and he applies it to the heart, saying, it begins here. Sin begins here. It's deep within the heart before an action is ever committed. The law of God was meant to not just govern your actions, but your attitude. It begins in the heart. In fact, I referenced covetousness. To covet, that is strictly an internal matter. When covetousness becomes external, then it's called something else. It's called, well, I covet this. Well, then it's called stealing. It's called adultery, or even in some cases to the extent of murder. It's all internal. It's not external. It's not an outward or overt action. So Jesus perfectly and succinctly answers the question of this religious lawyer. So now it's 3 up, 3 down, right? We've had the Pharisees and Herodians, we've had the Sadducees and the lawyer, but now Jesus is going to answer a question, or ask a question of them about the rightful Messiah, verse 41. While the Pharisees were gathered together, Jesus asked them, saying, what do you think about the Christ? Whose son is he? They said to him, the son of David. The most common term of the Jewish people that they had for the Messiah or the Christ, which is in the Greek, the word Christ and Messiah mean the same thing. Their most common term was the son of David. Ask a Jewish person, who is the Messiah? They'll say, well, it's the son of David. Now, why would they call the Messiah the son of David? Because God gave David a promise in 2 Samuel 7, verses 12 and 13, where he says, when your days are fulfilled and you rest with your fathers, I will set up your seed after you, who will come from your body, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. That's the promise. Now here's the question. Who would God be referring to when he says, your descendant will sit upon the throne forever? It can't be Solomon. Solomon was his son, but Solomon died. And his kingdom was not perpetual. On top of that, when Solomon died, the kingdom split in two with Jeroboam and Rehoboam, the southern kingdom and the northern kingdom. And then those two kingdoms were displaced by foreign powers. The northern kingdom, although those 10 tribes, they were taken over by the Assyrians, and then Judah, the southern tribes, the 2 southern tribes, were taken over by the Babylonians, captured by Babylon. So if God made a promise to David that his descendant will sit upon a throne, it can't be Solomon. He's dead. The kingdom was split. Who could he be referring to? They said it must be the Messiah. The Messiah will come and unite the nation of Israel. He will unite us as the son of David. And they were right in that sense. So they believed that the Messiah would be a human being, but they only believed he would be a human being only, not a divine being, like we know that Jesus is. They believed it would only be a human descendant of David. And the Pharisees either didn't know or they completely forgot that Jesus was of the line of King David, and he was even born in Bethlehem, the city of David. They forgot about all that because Jesus is primarily referred to as the Nazarene. Even in the triumphal entry, he is called the Jesus of Nazareth. He's referred to often throughout the New Testament. And so his connection to King David gets forgotten, or it was unknown to begin with. But that's the question. The Christ, whose son is he? The son of David. And Jesus says, well, you have a problem there because verse 43, he said to them, how then does David in the Spirit call him Lord, saying, the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand till I make your enemies your footstool. If David then calls him Lord, how is he his son? Now he's quoting from Psalm 110, which is the most frequently quoted Old Testament chapter in the New Testament. And that's why I often refer to Old Testament passages. I know I primarily teach through the New Testament on Sunday mornings, but the Old Testament is undergirds of much of what we read in the New Testament. The Old Testament is important. And Jesus certainly referred to it often, especially with the Jewish people here in the Gospel of Matthew. So he quotes a psalm they all knew, Psalm 110. So the Pharisees, they're correct in saying that the Messiah is the son of David, but they didn't have a complete understanding of who the Messiah is. He's not only David's son, which is a reference to his humanity, he's also David's Lord, a reference to his deity. The deity of Jesus, the Messiah. So Jesus is claiming his own deity here, like he has so often done, in ways that anyone who had any spiritual awareness or scriptural awareness as they were hearing him would have picked up on. So he's claiming his own deity here. If David in the Spirit called the Messiah his Lord, then how can it be David's son? David wouldn't call a mere human descendant of his Lord. That word Lord in the New Testament, Greek word kyrios, it means supreme authority. And he's quoting from Psalm 110, which is in the Hebrew, where we get the word Adonai, meaning master. Why would David call his descendant Lord? Supreme being, supreme authority, master. And that's a question they can't answer. But there is an answer to it. The reason David called him Lord is because the Messiah would be both human and divine. They couldn't get their minds wrapped around that. But you understand where Jesus is coming from. He is establishing himself as the rightful Messiah. So verse 46, and no one was able to answer him a word, nor from that day on did anyone dare question him anymore. I love that. That is wisdom. That is true spiritual wisdom. You have to have great wisdom to be able to shut down all of these different arguments in such a quick period of time to get that kind of reaction. All of his responses are very just short, one verse, two verse, just short sentences to silence all of their arguments against him and who he was and why he had the authority he had. These religious leaders had hoped to trap Jesus and to embarrass him in front of all of the Passover pilgrims who were coming through, the crowds that were crowding into Jerusalem who had heard him teach. But Jesus silences them and he embarrassed them instead. Jesus responds to all three of these loaded questions that came to him from all of these different angles. And they didn't dare ask him any more questions, not because they believed the truth, because they didn't want to face the truth. They were afraid to face the truth of who he was. And listen, that's a decision every person must make about who Jesus is. Is he the Messiah? To make a decision for Christ is a matter of life or death, spiritually speaking. Spiritual life or spiritual death. The evidence is there. It's there for all to examine. We can examine it defensively and miss the truth, or we can examine it humbly, honestly, openly, and discover the truth of who Jesus is, and we can believe it. We can believe Jesus for who he is. We can find salvation in Jesus Christ, the Messiah. We can find hope. We can find life, eternal life for eternity, resurrection life, abundant life, and we can live in the love of Christ. Live in the love that he has for us, and in response, loving God with all of our heart, soul, and mind, and love our neighbor as ourself. Amen. Let's go to the Lord in prayer.